A cold April morning in 1945. The heart of Europe was burning in blood and fire. As Nazi Germany took its final breath, Allied forces advanced relentlessly to bring down history's greatest tyranny. As American and British soldiers carried the banner of freedom deep into Germany, none of them could have imagined that this war would bring them not only victory, but also the love of their lives. This video tells the story of a love that blossomed in the darkest days of war, of hope that grew in the heart of the enemy, and of two different worlds coming together. If you want to hear one of the most extraordinary love stories born from war, you should watch this video until the end, because this story tells of events not written in history books, but that changed the fate of millions. Now, I want to ask you a question. Have you ever wondered whether a soldier walking through enemy territory could put down his weapon, look into a woman's eyes, and say, "I want to spend the rest of my life with you"? This might sound like a Hollywood movie, but sometimes life produces stories that even the best screenwriters couldn't imagine, and this story is completely true. In the final months of World War II, the Nazi regime was on the brink of collapse. The Reich that Adolf Hitler had claimed would last 1,000 years was about to crumble into rubble after just 12 years. Allied forces were squeezing Germany from the west, while the Soviets pressed from the east. Every day, thousands of German soldiers surrendered, and cities fell one by one. But in this chaotic environment of war, millions of civilians, women, children, and the elderly were struggling to survive in terrible uncertainty. Before you continue watching this video, if you haven't subscribed yet, I'd like you to hit the subscribe button right now, because on this channel, we tell stories hidden in the dusty pages of history that they won't teach you in school. And this story is just getting started. If you're ready, let's begin. During the American Army's advance, a young American soldier named Private First Class James Thompson entered a small town in the Bavarian region. James was an ordinary American young man from a small town in Ohio who had been farming before the war. But war drags ordinary people into extraordinary situations. James had been fighting since the Normandy landings. He had come face to face with death on the bloody sands of Omaha Beach. He had shivered in the freezing cold of the Ardennes trenches and watched his friends die before his eyes. The war had changed him. He was no longer a 22-year-old young man, but felt like someone who had lived hundreds of years. That April morning, when his unit entered a small German town, James was on alert as usual. The streets seemed deserted, windows were closed, doors were locked. They had encountered the same scene everywhere in Germany. Civilians were afraid of Allied soldiers. Nazi propaganda had portrayed American and British soldiers as monsters for years. Most of the population believed the Allies would kill or rape them. This fear had intensified as news spread of what the Soviet army was doing in the East. But American and British soldiers were different. They were not an army of revenge, but an army of liberation. Yes, they were fighting, but what they fought was the Nazi regime, not the German people. This distinction had been emphasized repeatedly to soldiers by Allied command. Civilians were to be treated with respect. Looting and violence were strictly forbidden. These principles were among the most important features that distinguished American and British armies from other armies of that era. As James and his unit advanced through the town, they noticed activity in a building near the square. The building had been used as a school before the war, but it was clear it now served a different purpose. Two elderly German women stood in front of the door, fear and worry on their faces. James's sergeant said they needed to check the building. Maybe there were German soldiers hiding. Maybe it was an arms depot, or maybe just civilians seeking shelter. When James opened the door, the scene inside shook him deeply. A large classroom was filled with dozens of women, but these weren't ordinary women. They wore gray and black uniforms. Some were wounded. All looked exhausted and weary. James couldn't understand what he was seeing for a moment. Then he realized. These were members of German women's auxiliary units, female support personnel of the Wehrmacht and Luftwaffe, women who had worked in communications, logistics, and administrative duties throughout the war. In Nazi Germany, women didn't fight on the front lines, but the war machine needed such massive manpower that hundreds of thousands of women had been employed in various roles. Women called Flakhelferinnen served in anti-aircraft batteries. Nachrichtenhelferinnen worked in communication centers. Stabshelferinnen handled administrative duties at headquarters. Most of these women had been recruited by force or semi-force. The Nazi regime, especially in the final years of the war, had applied great pressure to include women in the war effort. When James looked at the women in the room, he didn't see enemies. He saw frightened, tired, and hopeless people. Most of these women were his age. Some were even younger, 18, 19-year-old girls. Young people thrown into war, now waiting without knowing what the future would bring. The sergeant said the women needed to be registered as prisoners of war. This was standard procedure. All members of enemy forces, regardless of gender, had to be captured and registered. James and his comrades began to lead the women outside. Everything was calm. The women offered no resistance. They were in no condition to resist anyway. The war was over for them. That's when it happened. James noticed a woman sitting in the corner of the room. She sat somewhat apart from the others. Her blonde hair was dirty and disheveled. Her face was pale, but her eyes were blue and clear. They were the most beautiful eyes James had ever seen in his life. When the woman looked up at James, something happened between them. Something hard to describe in words. Maybe time stopped. Maybe the world spun. Or maybe two tired souls simply found a moment of peace in each other's eyes. If you're enjoying this story, please like and subscribe to the channel. The woman's name was Helga Schmidt. She was 21 years old. She was born in Munich. Before the war, she had wanted to become a teacher. She loved children, but the war had postponed her dreams to another time. At 19, she had been recruited into the Luftwaffe's communications unit. For 2 years, she had worked as a radio operator at an air base. She had received news of bombed cities and listened to the final messages of downed pilots. She had heard the brutality of war every day, every hour through her headphones. When James approached Helga, he didn't know what to say. He didn't speak English. Helga didn't speak German either. But sometimes people don't need words. James extended his hand to Helga. Helga hesitated for a moment. This man was the enemy. This man was a soldier from the army occupying her country. But there was no malice in his eyes, only exhaustion and kindness. Helga took James's hand and stood up. From that day on, James found himself thinking about that woman. Due to his duties, he was stationed near the prisoner camp, and a few days later he had the chance to see Helga again. This time, he had an American soldier serving as an interpreter with him. James said he wanted to talk to Helga. The interpreter was surprised but carried out the order. Helga couldn't understand why James wanted to talk to her. She was a prisoner of war. She had no rights. She could be interrogated at any time or sent to another camp. But James wasn't asking questions. He just wanted to talk. He asked about where she came from, her family, her dreams. Helga couldn't believe this American soldier's sincerity. Nazi propaganda had portrayed Americans as barbarians, but this man was polite, gentle, and respectful. As days passed, this strange relationship between James and Helga deepened. James visited the camp whenever he could and talked with Helga. The interpreter had grown accustomed to these meetings. He was even secretly watching the development of this love story with curiosity. In the darkest days of World War II, in enemy territory, an unexpected bond was forming between an American soldier and a German woman. But this story was just beginning. Were James's feelings for this woman simply wartime romance or something deeper? And could Helga trust an enemy soldier? In the chaos of war, how could two people from different worlds come together? The answers to these questions would emerge as the story continued. Meanwhile, if you enjoy hearing these unknown stories from history, don't forget to like this video. Your likes help us reach more people with this kind of content. And now, let's see how James and Helga's story developed. The advance of American and British armies in Germany formed one of the most remarkable chapters in the history of warfare. These soldiers weren't just winning a military victory, they were also changing the minds of a people poisoned by Nazi propaganda for years. German civilians saw that American and British soldiers acted humanely, contrary to expectations. There was no looting, there was no mass violence. Instead, Allied soldiers distributed food to civilians, helped the wounded, and tried to maintain order. This behavior was no coincidence. American and British command had established strict rules about how to treat civilians in occupied areas. General Dwight D. Eisenhower had given his soldiers a clear message. The Nazi regime and the German people were not the same thing. War criminals would be tried, but civilians would be protected. This approach laid the foundation for the reconstruction of post-war Germany. James Thompson was an individual reflection of this policy. He was a soldier trained to defeat the enemy, but he was also a man who had preserved his humanity. His interest in Helga wasn't just romantic attraction, it was also an expression of the desire to return to normal life after the horrors of war. James had seen only death and destruction for years. Now, even in enemy territory, he was searching for beauty and hope. Helga, on the other hand, viewed the world from a completely different perspective. She had grown up in Nazi Germany. She had been under the influence of the propaganda machine since she was 10. Organizations like the Hitler Youth and the League of German Girls had shaped her childhood and adolescence. But Helga was a thinking person. As the war progressed, she had begun to see the gap between propaganda and reality. The 1,000-year Reich she had been told about was collapsing before her eyes. Maybe it had been a lie from the very beginning. When she met James, Helga's world view was already beginning to crack. This American soldier looked nothing like the monster she had seen in propaganda films. He was kind, curious, and respectful. He talked about his own country, his family, his dreams. For the first time, Helga truly understood that an enemy was also a human being. And this realization was changing her outlook not just toward James, but toward the entire world. Conditions in the prisoner of war camp were managed according to American standards. This meant a very different experience from Nazi concentration camps or Soviet prisoner camps. Prisoners received proper food, medical care was provided. They received humane treatment. For Helga and the other female prisoners, this was a great relief. These women, who had feared falling into Soviet hands, felt relatively safe with the Americans. Every time James visited Helga, the bond between them grew stronger. They talked for hours through the interpreter. James described farm life in Ohio, the wheat fields, the old wooden house, the apple pie his mother made. Helga described her childhood in Munich, their trips to the Alps, her father's bookshop, her dream of becoming a teacher. Two different worlds were being connected by a bridge of words. One day, James said something unexpected to Helga. Even the interpreter was surprised as he conveyed these words. James had said, "When the war is over, I want to marry you." Helga froze when she heard these words. This was impossible. She was a prisoner of war. She was German. American soldiers couldn't marry German women. And only a few weeks had passed since they met. This was madness. But James looked at her with serious eyes. This wasn't a momentary whim. For the first time in his life, James was determined to pursue something he felt this strongly about. War had taught him many things. Above all, how short and precious life was. In a world where death lurked around every corner, there was no time to wait for the person you loved. Helga didn't know what to say to James's proposal, but the tears in her eyes were part of the answer. We've reached the end of the first part of this video. James and Helga's story isn't over yet. In fact, the most difficult part was just beginning. How could an American soldier marry a German woman despite wartime regulations? Would bureaucracy, prejudice, and thousands of miles of distance become obstacles to this love? And most importantly, could this wartime love survive in peacetime? Don't miss the next episode to find out the answers to all these questions. This story continues to be one of the most extraordinary love stories born from war, and I promise you what comes next will be even more surprising. Like this video for this impossible love, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Let's continue. Welcome to the second part. We're continuing without slowing down. This love story that began in the middle of war was now preparing to face an even more difficult test. James Thompson, a young American soldier, had proposed to a German woman he met in enemy territory. Helga Schmidt was trying to understand if this proposal was real. As a prisoner of war, she had no rights. Her future was completely uncertain. And now an American soldier was promising her a new life. Could this be real? If you haven't watched the first part of this video, I recommend you stop now and watch it first, because you need to know the beginning to fully understand this story. And if you have watched it, get ready, because this part of the story will take you into much deeper waters. James's marriage proposal wasn't just a romantic gesture. This proposal challenged all the rules, traditions, and prejudices of the era. In 1945, an American soldier marrying a German woman seemed almost impossible. First, there were military regulations. The American Army had established strict rules prohibiting soldiers from marrying local women in occupied territories. This rule was even stricter for Germany. Germany was the enemy. Millions of American soldiers had fought against Nazi Germany. Thousands had died. Now, for an American to want to marry a German woman was unacceptable to many. But James was determined. The most important thing he had learned during the war was to fight for what he believed was right, and he wholeheartedly believed his relationship with Helga was right. As a first step, he decided to talk to his commanders. When Battalion Commander Captain Robert Miller heard James's request, he first thought it was a joke. But when he realized James was serious, the expression on his face changed. Captain Miller was a good officer. He knew his soldiers and valued them. James was one of his most trusted men. They had fought together since Normandy. He knew James's courage and character. But this request was far beyond his authority. Miller explained the situation clearly to James. Such a marriage was not legally possible at this time. Military regulations prohibited it. Moreover, Helga was a prisoner of war. Even having a relationship with prisoners was a serious offense. James was risking his entire career and perhaps his freedom. James listened to these warnings, but didn't give up. "If we can't marry now, we'll marry when the war is over," he said. "I just made her a promise, and I will keep my word." Captain Miller didn't know what to say in the face of this young soldier's determination. Finally, he took a deep breath and said, "Wait until the war is over. Maybe the rules will change then. But for now, don't talk to anyone about this. I can't protect you if the higher-ups find out." James followed his commander's advice, but continued to visit Helga. He needed to be more careful now. He reduced his visits, but each meeting became more meaningful. The interpreter continued to be a faithful bridge between these two lovers. In fact, the interpreter, Corporal William Harris, was one of the hidden heroes of this story. Harris, who came from a Jewish family, was the son of an immigrant who had fled to America to escape Nazi persecution. He had learned German from his family. His reason for joining the war was to fight against Hitler. But now he was witnessing a love story in enemy territory. Harris had initially approached this relationship with suspicion. His family had fled Nazi persecution. He had every reason to hate Germans. But as he got to know Helga, he understood that she too was a victim. Helga didn't support Nazi ideology. She was just a young person trying to survive. And now, seeing the hope in this young woman's eyes was softening Harris's heart. Perhaps the true victory of war was finding humanity beyond enmity. While watching this video, maybe you're wondering, is love really possible in the middle of war? Can enemies really love each other? These questions weren't limited to James and Helga's story. Throughout World War II, similar stories had occurred. American and British soldiers had met local women throughout Europe, fallen in love, and married. Most of these relationships were formalized in the post-war period, but relationships in Germany formed a special category, because Germany was the enemy. When the war ended, the map of Europe was being redrawn. Nazi Germany had officially surrendered. Hitler had committed suicide. High-ranking Nazi officials had been captured or fled. The Nuremberg trials were being prepared, and millions of people were trying to build new lives among the ruins of war. For James, the end of the war meant strengthening hope of being with Helga. But things wouldn't be that easy. The American Occupation Administration continued to enforce strict rules in Germany. The fraternization ban, the prohibition of American soldiers forming close relationships with German civilians, continued for some time after the war ended. This ban was put in place both to maintain military discipline and to satisfy American public opinion. Many families in America had lost their sons or husbands in the war. It was difficult for these families to accept American soldiers having romantic relationships with enemy women. But the realities of post-war Germany made it impossible to continue these policies. Millions of American soldiers were stationed in Germany. These soldiers were in daily contact with the German civilian population, and inevitably, relationships developed. American command had to admit that the fraternization ban was impractical in practice. Toward the end of 1945, this ban began to be relaxed. James was closely following these developments. Each new regulation meant one step closer to Helga. But there were still major obstacles. Most importantly, Helga's prisoner of war status. As long as she remained a prisoner, marriage was out of the question. James tried every avenue to get Helga released. He wrote petitions, he met with his commanders, he sought legal advice, but bureaucracy moved slowly. There were millions of prisoners of war in Germany, and each of their files needed to be reviewed. Helga showed incredible patience during this period of uncertainty. Conditions in the prisoner camp had improved compared to wartime, but she was still going through difficult days. She was trying to communicate with her family, but Germany's infrastructure had collapsed. The postal system wasn't working properly. She didn't even know if her father and mother were alive. Munich had been subjected to heavy bombardment during the war. Helga spent sleepless nights thinking about her family's fate. James shared Helga's concerns. He made her a promise. "We will find your family," he said. "I'll do whatever it takes." This promise was an important detail that showed James's character. He didn't just love Helga, he also accepted her family, her past, and her identity. This was the sign of true love. In post-war Germany, American and British soldiers became not just occupiers, but also pioneers of reconstruction. The Marshall Plan had not yet been implemented, but Allied forces were working to meet Germany's basic needs. Food distribution, healthcare services, and infrastructure repair were priorities. American soldiers took an active role in these efforts, and in the process, relationships with the German civilian population inevitably developed. During his duties, James had the opportunity to get to know Germany more closely. He saw the destruction of war, the bombed cities, orphaned children, destroyed homes, but he also saw the resilience of the German people. People were trying to build new lives from the rubble. This sight changed James's view of the world. He understood that the people he had seen as enemies were actually ordinary people like himself. War was between governments and ideologies, but it was always ordinary people who suffered. This awareness deepened James's love for Helga even further. Helga was one of the victims of war. She had been born at the wrong time, in the wrong place. She had grown up under the Nazi regime, been drawn into the war, and was now a citizen with an uncertain fate in a defeated nation. But despite these circumstances, Helga hadn't lost hope. She had managed to preserve her humanity, and this was the quality James valued most. As months passed, James and Helga's story became a small legend among the unit. Interpreter Harris had told this story to close friends. They told others. Soon, many American soldiers were aware of this love story. Reactions were mixed. Some supported James. "The war is over. Life goes on," they said. But some strongly opposed. There were those who said, "Sleeping with Germans means betraying our martyrs." James didn't care about these criticisms. He had witnessed the deaths of his friends throughout the war. He knew this pain better than anyone. But he also knew that the cause of the war was the Nazi regime, not the German people. Helga wasn't a supporter of Hitler. She was just a young person living in Germany at that time. Blaming her for where she was born was injustice. Now pause this video for a moment and think. If you were in James's place, what would you do? Write your thoughts in the comments. Would you stand against all social pressure for the woman you love? Or would you conform and give up this relationship? This question is one that not just James, but every person faces at some point. How much are we prepared to fight for love? In early 1946, James's patience finally began to bear fruit. Helga's file had been reviewed. It was determined that she hadn't been involved in war crimes. She was just a communications operator. She hadn't participated in any atrocities. This result opened the way for Helga's release. In March 1946, Helga was officially removed from prisoner of war status. She was now a free German citizen. When James received this news, he experienced indescribable happiness. But things weren't over yet. Helga was free, but James was still a soldier in the American Army, and American soldiers had to obtain special permission to marry German citizens. Obtaining this permission was a long and difficult process. But James wasn't afraid of this process. He had struggled with much more difficult obstacles until now. The first step was to make a formal marriage application. James gathered all the necessary documents: his own identification, military records, Helga's release documents, character references. The application would be sent first to the unit command, then to higher levels. At each stage, the application would be reviewed and needed to be approved. This process could take months. Meanwhile, James was also working to find Helga's family. He applied to the Red Cross. He sought help from American military intelligence. And finally, good news came. Helga's family was alive. Her father and mother had survived the bombing in Munich. Their home had been destroyed, but they had taken refuge with a relative. When Helga received this news, she burst into tears. For the first time in months, she felt truly hopeful. James wanted to meet Helga's family. This was both a gesture of respect for tradition and a step toward the future. If they were going to marry, family approval was important. But this wouldn't be an easy meeting. How would Helga's family receive their daughter's relationship with an American soldier? They had lost everything in the war. Now their daughter wanted to marry an enemy soldier. James prepared carefully for this meeting. He tried to learn some German. He bought small gifts. He arranged chocolate and coffee from American Army rations. These were very valuable things in post-war Germany. Black market prices were astronomical. James knew it was a bit strange to go to Helga's family with these gifts, but it was also a practical gesture. This was the way to help a family in need. When the day of the meeting came, James's heart was pounding as if it would burst from his chest. He hadn't been this nervous even during the Normandy landings. Walking down a ruined Munich street beside Helga, he didn't know what he would encounter. The relative's home was an apartment that had suffered relatively little damage from the war. Helga's father opened the door. Herr Schmidt was a man in his early 60s, tired-looking but dignified. Before the war, he had been a bookshop owner. He was a cultured and educated person. Now he had lost everything and was a father worried about his daughter's future. When he looked at James, complex emotions could be read on his face: anger, suspicion, or just exhaustion. Helga introduced James to her father. There was no interpreter this time. Helga had learned some English over the past months. James had also memorized a few German sentences. Communication would be difficult but not impossible. Herr Schmidt invited James inside. German hospitality was still valid despite the war. That evening, in a small, dim room, people from two enemy nations sat face to face. James presented his gifts. Frau Schmidt, Helga's mother, teared up when she saw the chocolate. They hadn't seen such a luxury in months. James introduced himself in broken German. He explained that he came from Ohio, that he was from a farming family, what he had done before the war. Herr Schmidt listened carefully. If you loved this story, please like and subscribe. Thank you. Then Herr Schmidt began to speak, with slow and careful words, in a way James could understand. He said how terrible the war had been. He described what they had lost: the shop, the house, friends, neighbors, everything. But most importantly, he said he hadn't lost hope because his daughter was alive, and now his daughter had a chance to be happy. When James heard these words, he felt relieved. Herr Schmidt wasn't opposing the marriage. He just wanted to be sure of his daughter's happiness. James said he loved Helga and would take good care of her. He promised. An American's word meant his honor. Herr Schmidt looked into James's eyes. There was a long moment of silence. Then the old man nodded. He was accepting. That night, a new page opened in James and Helga's story. The family obstacle had been overcome, but there were still official obstacles. The American marriage application was still pending. American bureaucracy moved slowly, and James's military service term was also a problem. When he would be discharged was uncertain. He didn't know how much longer he would stay in Germany. If he was sent to America, would he be able to take Helga with him? These questions occupied James and Helga's minds for most of 1946, but neither gave up. James continued to follow up on his application. He met with his superiors at every opportunity. Helga continued her English lessons. If she was going to America, she needed to learn the language. Both were doing everything they could to make this relationship work. And finally, their patience was rewarded. At the end of 1946, James's marriage application was approved. The American Army officially permitted this marriage. This decision set a precedent not just for James and Helga, but for hundreds of couples in similar situations. In the post-war period, thousands of marriages would take place between American soldiers and German women. James and Helga were among the pioneers of this wave. There were still a few months until the wedding ceremony, but now everything was finalized. James and Helga were officially engaged. This story that had begun 2 years ago in a prisoner of war camp was progressing toward a happy ending. But the story wasn't over yet. Perhaps the hardest part would come after this: Helga's adaptation to America, the merging of two different cultures, and building a new life. We've reached the end of this part. James and Helga's story doesn't end here. In the third and final part, I will tell you about their marriage, their journey to America, and their new lives. And I promise you, the finale will surprise you greatly. The ending of this story is as impressive as its beginning. If you were moved by this story, don't forget to like the video. Likes help us reach more people with this kind of content. And get ready for the third part, because I've saved the best for last. If you're curious about how the story ends, let's move on to the final part right away. Welcome to the third and final part. We're continuing the story at full speed. Spring of 1947. Germany was still trying to heal the wounds of war. Cities were filled with piles of rubble. Millions of people were homeless and hungry. Streets were covered with debris and despair. But in the middle of this dark picture, a historic moment was taking place in a small church. James Thompson and Helga Schmidt were finally getting married. This story that had begun 2 years ago in a prisoner camp was now becoming an official union. The love that had blossomed in enemy territory had overcome all obstacles. The bureaucracy, the prejudices, thousands of miles of distance, and most importantly, the deep wounds left by the war. The wedding ceremony was simple but meaningful. In a small Protestant church, there were only a few guests. A few friends from James's unit had come, men they had fought side by side with. Helga's family was also there. Her father, Herr Schmidt, came to give away his daughter. There was both pride and sadness on his face. He was losing his daughter, but at the same time he was seeing her happiness. And of course, the hidden hero of this story, Corporal William Harris, was also there. His role that had started as an interpreter had now turned into a friendship. The church had been damaged in the war. The stained glass windows were broken. The colored glass pieces had long been collected. The walls were cracked. The ceiling was leaking from one corner. But inside, hope and love prevailed. There was something in this place that the war couldn't destroy. Helga was wearing her mother's old wedding dress, a dress saved from the war, patched but still beautiful. Her mother had worn this dress 25 years ago. Now her daughter was wearing it. A bond between generations was felt in every stitch of the fabric. James was waiting at the altar in his pressed uniform. His medals gleamed on his chest, the bronze star, the purple heart. These medals were symbols of his courage and sacrifice. But today, he was winning his greatest victory. He was marrying the woman he loved. If you haven't watched the previous parts of this video, I recommend going back and watching them now. You need to know the beginning to understand the full depth of this story. But if you've made it this far, get ready, because this final part contains the most emotional portion of the story. The priest conducted the ceremony in both German and English. 2 languages, 2 cultures, 1 love. Each sentence was spoken twice, first in German, then in English. This wedding wasn't just the union of 2 people, it was the meeting of 2 worlds. When James looked at Helga's face, he remembered that moment from 2 years ago, the moment he first saw the blonde woman sitting in the corner of the dim room of the prisoner camp. Those blue eyes, that tired but hopeful gaze. He hadn't fully understood what he felt at that time. Now he understood. Fate had brought him together with this woman, and he had embraced his destiny. After the wedding, a new struggle began for James and Helga, the process of going to America. This was a process as difficult as the wedding, perhaps even more so. Helga wasn't an American citizen. Special visa procedures were required as a war bride. The War Brides Act had been passed by Congress in 1945. This law made it easier for foreign women married to American soldiers to immigrate to America. Thousands of British, French, and Italian women had benefited from this law. But for German brides, the process was much more complicated because Germany was the enemy. Helga's file was reviewed again. Her past was investigated in the finest detail. Nazi connections were questioned. What organizations had she been a member of? What had she done during the war? Had she been involved in any crimes? These questions were asked repeatedly. Helga gave the same answers every time. She was just a communications operator. She had sat at a radio and relayed messages. She hadn't witnessed any atrocities. She hadn't participated in any crimes. This process was humiliating and exhausting for Helga. She was being treated as if she were guilty, but she had to endure. James was by her side every step of the way. He fought the bureaucracy, he wrote petitions, he testified, he vouched for Helga's character. And finally, in the summer of 1947, Helga's visa was approved. She was free. She could go to America. The journey to America was by ship. The USS General Ballou was one of the ships carrying war brides. Crossing the Atlantic Ocean was still a long and difficult journey in those days. It would take 12 days. Helga was sailing across the ocean for the first time in her life. Standing on the ship's deck, she thought about everything she was leaving behind. Her family, her homeland, the streets of her childhood. Everything familiar was shrinking on the horizon. Ahead of her was a completely unknown world, a new country, a new language, a new culture, a new life. Frightening, but at the same time, exciting. James was standing next to Helga on the deck. The sea breeze was blowing through their hair. He took her hand and said, "You're home now. Wherever I am, that's your home." These words warmed Helga's heart. Yes, she was leaving everything behind, but beside her was a man who loved her and valued her. That was enough. Love is sometimes all you need. When they arrived at New York Harbor, the Statue of Liberty greeted them. Helga held her breath when she saw this enormous statue. She had seen it in pictures for so many years. Now it was real. America was real. Her new life was real. Tears streamed from her eyes. These were tears of both sadness and happiness. The journey to Ohio continued by train. The vastness of America amazed Helga. All of Germany would fit into a small corner of this country. During the hours-long train journey, she watched the scenery from the window. Endless plains, small towns, wheat fields. Everything was new and different. James's family was waiting for them at the station. In the small town of Ohio, the Thompson family had come to see this German bride with curiosity. James's mother, Martha, knew Helga from her son's letters. In the letters that came every week, James had mentioned Helga, but seeing her face to face was different. When Helga got off the train, Martha paused for a moment. Before her was a tired but beautiful young woman. The long journey had worn her out, but her eyes were shining. In those eyes, fear and hope danced together. Martha instinctively hugged Helga. Words weren't necessary. A mother was accepting the woman her son loved. A warm embrace said more than 1,000 words. James's father, Robert, was more distant at first. He had lost 2 nephews in the war. They had died at Normandy. He carried complex feelings about Germans. His handshake was formal and cold, but Helga understood this. Time would be needed, and Helga was a patient woman. The first months were difficult. Helga's English was still weak. Even understanding daily conversations required effort. American culture was foreign to her. The food was different. So much meat, so many sweets. The traditions were different. Holidays, celebrations, social rules. Even the weather was different. Ohio summers were much hotter and more humid than Munich. Helga sometimes felt homesick. Waking up at midnight and thinking in German, she missed her family. But James was always by her side. He supported her. He gave her time to adjust. He wasn't hasty. He was patient. Slowly, Helga began to embrace Ohio. She met the neighbors. First hesitant glances, then kind smiles, finally sincere friendships. She joined the women's club. She continued taking English lessons. She learned new words every day. And most importantly, the townspeople began to accept her. At first there were whispers, looks that said, "That German woman." But Helga's hard work, courtesy, and contribution to the community slowly melted these prejudices. James had returned to the farm after the war. His father was getting older and needed help. Helga began helping with farm work. She had grown up in the city in Germany, but she was willing to learn. She learned to feed the chickens. She got up at the crack of dawn to go to the barn. She took care of the garden work. She learned to cook American dishes from Martha: apple pie, cornbread, fried chicken. And in return, she taught Martha German recipes: Sauerbraten, Kartoffelsuppe, Apfelstrudel. A special bond formed between the two women. They found a common language. Food was a universal language. In 1948, James and Helga's first child was born, a boy, healthy and strong. They named him William, in honor of interpreter Harris. When Harris received this news, his eyes filled with tears. This friendship that had started in wartime would last a lifetime. Little William was a child of two worlds, American and German, and this dual heritage would become part of his identity. Don't forget to like and subscribe for this challenging love story. Years passed. James and Helga's family grew. After William came two more girls, Elizabeth and Anna. The farm expanded. James began applying modern farming techniques, tractors, new irrigation systems. Productivity increased. Helga began teaching when the children reached school age. She taught German and music classes at the town's elementary school. She had finally realized her childhood dream. Her German accent never completely went away, but her students loved her. James Thompson passed away in 1998 at the age of 83. He had lived a long and full life. Helga closed her eyes 5 years later, in 2003. Their 56-year marriage was proof of the permanence of a love born from war. They left behind 3 children, 7 grandchildren, and 4 great-grandchildren. What does this story teach us? Perhaps that even in the darkest times of war, the light of humanity cannot be extinguished. James Thompson was an American soldier. He had fought for freedom, and in the middle of war, he had found love. British and American soldiers didn't just win a military victory in World War II, they represented the best values of humanity. If this story moved you, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments. Your support is what makes it possible for us to tell these stories. In our next video, we'll tell the incredible escape story of British soldiers from a German prisoner camp. Tunnels, secret plans, and courage. Don't miss it. See you then. Take care of yourselves. Goodbye.